Welcome back to Withdraw Consent. I'm Jack. Today I want to talk about the credibility of the Nuremberg Trials. So the Nuremberg Trials took place after World War II in 1945, and then they dragged into 1946. They took 22 of the top German officials, just the top officials, because there were other people tried all over the place. But these are the top ones, kind of like the show trial, but kind of on radio. And they tried 22 of them to see if they could, how many they could execute. You had the Americans, the French, and the French played a smaller part, but they were involved. The British and the Soviets were the prosecution, but they were also the judges and stuff. So, anyways, we want to look at how credible they were. Now, even if you find that they weren't credible, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the things that they were charged with didn't necessarily, they could have still happened, you know? But I just want to look at if you were in an argument with somebody about the Holocaust and they said, look at all the evidence of the Nuremberg trials. That's what I want to combat right now. Okay. So I put a lot of work into this. It's going to be kind of a long episode, and there's just a lot of really interesting facts. So I've numbered the references below, and the first 5 are all about just specifically the Nuremberg trials. The first one's the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The second one is the National World War II Museum, New Orleans. The third one is the Jewish Virtual Library. The fourth one is a 2.5-hour documentary by Zoomer historian who's pretty fantastic when it comes to history, and it's called The Complete Story of the Nuremberg Trials. If you want more, it's worth doing right there. And the fifth reference below is just a book that it won't really link to anything, but it'll just show you a book that I really use as a good source on this. And it's called Imperium, The Philosophy of History and Politics by Francis Parker Yockey. Very good book on it. Now, if you were talking to Zoomer historian who did the YouTube channel, the fourth reference below, he would refer you to read David Irving's book on it. But there's a lot of good sources out there. So anyways, one of the things we got to understand before we even go into the details of this is that the two options the Germans had were either they were just going to be out of hand executed as soon as they were found, or they were going to get this Nuremberg trial. So in essence, if you're into due process and stuff like that, the Nuremberg trial was the better outcome for law and order, justice, due process, stuff like that. If you're just into just killing people without finding out because people are going to get acquitted at this trial, you know? But the other option was all 22 of them would have just been executed, right? So if you look at American-controlled Italy, let's think about the Nuremberg trials there. Oh, wait, there were none because everybody was just assassinated. In complete war crimes, all of the fascist leadership was killed. Whether that was done by the Americans or the Italians themselves doesn't really matter because it's in American-occupied Italy. So if the Americans are just looking the other way, some guilt there. Anyways, so I'm just going to tell you some interesting stories about how the trials were set up. So basically, there were 2 generals involved that were charged with crimes, and neither. Well, there was also an admiral. There's Admiral Donuts, but let's talk about the generals. So there's General Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl, and they basically couldn't do this to them because it wasn't legal to take them to the Nuremberg trials. So they compelled the German army to discharge them from the military, then arrest them as civilians. So they didn't have to be treated under the 1929 Geneva Convention as POWs, which they were. So obviously, that's nonsense. And then some of the crimes that Germany has been claimed that they did was basically they were the belligerent. They started the war. And so if you want to look at, I'm gonna put a link to an episode about how did World War II start, and that's Victor and I in that one. It's kind of longish, but we talk about all the details about how it started and whether or not they were actually a belligerent. But I just want to point out that all 4 countries who were accusing them, France, America, Britain, and the USSR, are all fine with wars of belligerents as long as they feel that they're justified. Like being a belligerent in a war doesn't necessarily. Now I'm a non-interventionist, so I'm not a fan of belligerents. But if you look at, say, United States of America, no matter when you were born, I can point you to a host of wars where the United States was belligerent. So not Iraq won, because Iraq won. Saddam Hussein was being belligerent against Kuwait, and then we responded with a coalition, even though, of course, they thought they had our approval, and they celebrated, the day before because anyways, but so if you look at, just us invading like countries that had nothing to do with 9/11, like Afghanistan and Iraq at the second time and stuff like that, that's just belligerence. But if you justify it on the national security, and I'm a non-interventionist, so I'm not for any of this, but I'm saying these countries, it's silly that just belligerence is a thing because they all agree that that's okay. Now let's look at the rules behind this trial because this is great, right? So 3 rules. I'm categorizing them into 3 rules. They're not official rules. Well, they were official rules at the time, but it's not officially 3. There was many more than this, but the interesting ones. So they made the rule that you can't claim as a defense that you were just following orders, right? Which is a thing we hear about the Holocaust and World War II a lot, But the problem is there was laws in Britain and Germany, so Britain the accuser and Germany the accused, saying that if you get orders that are unlawful, you kind of got to follow them. You have to follow orders. Now, like the laws, there's nuance there. Like the laws say that if you don't know that the law is unlawful, which of course, if you were using a homicidal gas chamber, we're not claiming that. But if you don't know the law is unlawful, then you're innocent, even though you commit, like say, a war crime, right? So that'd be something more technical and not something obvious. But if you are ordered to do something that's unlawful and you do it, then you're just the accomplice, not the main perpetrator of the crime, and you're under less scrutiny. Anyway, so Britain and Germany both had laws saying that, but we're not going to allow you to use that defense, right? Secondly, they said you can't complain in your defense that laws you have broken were made after you committed the crime, So that we'll leave that one there. Next one, even more interesting. You can't use the "you did it too" defense. So like, you can't claim, "Hey, well, you committed this crime as well," because the problem is the Allies had done every single thing that they accused the Germans of doing, right? So let's look at this, like the belligerents. Let's go back to the belligerents. Okay, so I'm not going to go into details. It's in that episode that I linked below. But basically, the war starts when Germany invades Poland, right? But 3 weeks later, the Soviets also invaded Poland from the other side, right? And the Soviets are the accusers here. So the specific thing that you're doing, that you're accusing them of, you literally did that thing. Or they're like, well, you invaded Norway. Well, it comes out in the trial, and they actually suppress evidence of it because it would lead to other incriminating things that the British have done. The British suppress it. That they also were going to invade Norway and attempted to, as a matter of fact. And then they're like, well, you invaded the neutral countries of Belgium, and Holland. And then, of course, you look at it and you're like, okay, well, Britain also invaded the neutral country of Iceland, which was a province of the Danish who were under German occupation. But Iceland was free and neutral, and they were invaded by the British. And then also, well, yeah, the British invaded neutral Iran. So, whatever. So basically, as far as killing people goes, the Americans did a massacre at the Battle of the Bulge. They killed 80 German POWs. It's called the Yockey Massacre. Now, they did that purportedly in response to just a short time earlier, the Germans massacring a group of American POWs. I don't know if either of these stories are true. I'm assuming they both are. They're both parts of the regular narrative, but I've never looked into them. I'm just showing that both sides are doing the same thing. In Italy, the American soldiers just went on sprees of fully taking advantage of the women, we'll say. Now, this happened over 100 times, but there were also over 100 prosecutions, So I'm not gonna give the Americans too much bad for that, because I always say your military is welcome to commit crimes, and if your military prosecutes every one of those crimes, like when Snowden leaked all those war crimes, the problem was nobody had ever been prosecuted for those, And so if we want to go back to the Yockey massacre, I'm not pronouncing that right, I'm sure, where the Americans massacred the 80 Germans, then nobody was ever tried for that. It was just shoved under the table, and that's where the Americans are wrong. There was also the Dachau liberation reprisals, where they lined up 35 to 50 surrendered prison guards and just mass murdered them. If you want to talk about forced labor, which was a big thing because, forced labor of civilian populations and stuff became illegal in 1949. So these trials were over by then, you know. But it is a big thing where you look back on it and you say, hey, this is immoral, even though everybody's always done this, and then we're going to try to get them to stop doing it after this war. But if you look at it, so that became illegal in the Geneva Convention of 1949. And then, so before that, though, and after the war, German POWs were sold to Belgian coal mines, right? And they had specific prices, depending if you get like an NCO or just an enlisted man, right? They had specific prices. And then they were also sold to the French, and the French were mistreating the German slave laborers that they had bought. They were mistreating them so heavily that the Allies in Germany said, hey, we're going to stop giving you slaves unless you treat the slaves a little bit better. So they actually upped their treatment of the German slaves and then sent more German slaves over there. In 1947, so after the trial is over, the trial will end in 46. The year later, there's still 2.5 million German POWs doing slave labor in Russia. We know how that ended and how many of those made it back. So, you know, okay, so let's move on. We'll talk about the treatment of the prisoners. So they basically, everybody was in solitary confinement, and everybody went on basically starvation rations. And so like one guy Goering lost like 60 pounds and stuff. Now he was overweight to begin with. They gave him 10 minutes of exercise per day. One of them was in such bad health and he kept having heart attacks in his cell and they just wouldn't help him, that eventually the doctor said, if you want to get this guy to trial so that you can convict him and then you can execute him, you're going to have to give him more physical exercise or he's just not going to make it. So they started increasing just his amount of physical exercise so that he could live long enough that they could kill him, of course, you know. And then now there was this one guy and he was not an important guy and he was not even one of the 22. And I mean, we just have documentation about the mistreatment of this guy. So they had like a Jewish guy, you know, who was in charge, and then a black guy, and they would do things like force him to open his mouth and make the black guy spit in his mouth 3 times a day. He had to drink out of the urinal. The black guy would cuff him, take off his clothes, cuff him, throw the clothes in a toilet full of feces, and then tell him to get dressed in the feces. Clothes. They had him kiss the black dude's feet like that. I mean, they were really mistreating this guy. They made him put his handcuffed hands above his head, and they beat him in the testicles. And if he moved his hands down to block a blow, then they would just beat the living tar out of him, stand him back up, put his hands above his head, and start again. Now, I will note that to be historically accurate, that happened, but most of the stories that you hear and that I have told in the past about people's testicles being smashed in, like when the International Committee for the Red Cross came in and noted what percentage of the Germans had their testicles kicked in, that was at Dachau. So that was more related to the Dachau trials, which we'll talk about. But I just want to clarify that, okay? So they also did this thing where they so we'll just more about that. They basically would have them in these cells, and then they were trying to keep them from killing themselves too. So they had basically a spotlight on their face. Now the spotlight, they turned the lumens down, you know, at night, but it was still a spotlight on their face, and there was somebody staring at them. Especially as it went farther and farther on, and more of them escaped the noose. We'll say, we'll talk about that. So they stole everybody's diaries, and they withheld or destroyed them so that they couldn't use them for their own defense to show what their state of mind was like at times. So we're going to see one guy in a second, and he's going to when he's arrested, he's going to bring them 40 diaries of his so that he can show what he was thinking, what he was going through at the exact times, like when he did the things they say he did. And they're going to not let them use him in his own defense, and they're going to keep him in the same building with him as an irony. Anyways, so they would do things like the defense would have witnesses, and they would take, and the witnesses for the defense would be interrogated by the prosecutors, and then they'd put them in solitary confinement before the defense even gets to question them to see if they're going to use them as a defense witness, you know? So that sounds great. Okay. This is a true story, but this is ridiculous. The prisoners' wives, so the wives of the prisoners were locked up in civilian internment camps, right? And their kids were put in orphanages or foster care. So they took the wives of people who they claim have committed crimes, and they've claimed that the wives have committed no crimes, lock them up in civilian internment camps. That's a concentration camp, okay? This is the Allies, and this is not the Soviets. This is the Western Allies. This is insane. You know, these are the good guys, just in case you lost sight of what's going on here. So one guy is even going to say, you know what? I regret all this, and I'm gonna go with the Allies on this. You know, I'm just gonna confess on all these people, and I'm gonna do the. And then they took his wife away and put her in a concentration camp. Took his kid and put him in an orphanage. He said, you know what? No, Germany to the end. You know what I mean? I mean, I get it. I would whatever. Why wouldn't be breaking it down in the first place? But so basically, I want to go to one of these sites. I want to go over the 22 people. I want to tell you unique stories about each one of them that I've found and throughout various resources, and we're going to read what they did, what they're accused of. So let's flop over here, and this is going to be the very first reference below, reference number 1, and this is International Military Tribunal, the defendants. So this is from the USHMM, right? So this is really pro-Holocaust. There's no spin on this. This is going to be the straight government narrative story. So basically, let me make this text a little bit bigger for you. So there was 4 charges that everybody was charged with, okay? And I'm just going to keep going. Okay, so here are the 4 charges. The first one is conspiracy to commit any of the next 3 charges, which is crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So that's conspiracy to commit those. Number 2 is crimes against peace. Number 3 is war crimes. And number 4 is crimes against humanity, actually doing that crime. And they sound really vague, but they have all of these specific things that if you do these things, you've committed war crimes. And I mean, if you really get down to it, they're kind of guilty. Most of them are guilty of all of these, but also all of the Allies are guilty of all of these because the rules are so specific. So now let's look at let's start at this nonsense. Okay. The first guy of the 22 we're going to talk about, his name is Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach. I'm not even going to read this stuff. He was Adolf Hitler fan. But the funny part of this story here is that they had so little knowledge of what was going on. They went and got the wrong guy. They wanted the son, but they went for the father. And the father was so elderly, he was deemed too ill to stand trial at the International Military Tribunal and at the subsequent Krupp case here in 1947. He died in 1950. They never went for the right guy, who was the son. They went for the decrepit, dying, mentally infirm father. So that's not that. I mean, it shows how inept they were. But okay, next one, Robert Ley. Okay. So this guy, he was a trade union guy. He was head of the DAF, which is the German Labor Party, or the Deutsche Arbeitsfront. And he was the, quote, undisputed dictator of labor, end quote, in Germany. And the organization's membership totaled 25 million. Nevertheless, during the war, he was overshadowed in labor issues by rivals like Albert Speer and Fritz Sauckel, who we'll see in the trial as well. His co-defendants in 1945, obsessed with the idea of becoming a martyr, Ley committed suicide in his cell at Nuremberg shortly before trial began. That's not true at all. He became insane, lost his mind, and when he did kill himself, like, he literally put a blanket around and just kept pulling until I don't know humans who can pull that off. And what they had 100 suicide notes, as well as just some wild like drawings of demons and stuff. Like, this guy had lost it. He was gone. He was gone after basically the solitary confinement and stuff that the Allies put him on broke him. And I'm not blaming you're allowed to put people in solitary confinement. I'm talking about the stableness of his mind. So then anyway, so he escaped the noose, Robert Ley. He did too. He didn't even end up, Krupp didn't even end up. So Martin Bormann also did too. Now, this was Hitler's deputy, and he was the chief of staff for Rudolf Hess, not Hus that we talked about in the last episode. This is Rudolf Hess, the vice Führer. And virtually unknown to the German public, but a close assistant to Hitler. Okay, so when Rudolf Hess flew on the peace mission to Great Britain in 1941, Bormann became head of the party chancellery and officially in 1943 secretary to the Führer. Okay, his hand could be seen in an array of domestic policies, including the plunder of artwork, the persecution of Jews, the euthanasia effort, and the expansion of forced labor programs. He also signed a series of edicts ordering Jewish deportations to the east. He died in an effort to flee Berlin in the last days of World War II, but was long thought to be at large. He was tried in absentia, where he was sentenced to death. Okay, West German authorities officially declared him dead in 1973 after his remains were discovered and positively identified. So he was dead back then, but they've actually found his remains much later. And basically, so they kept him at trial in case he turned up and they found him. Then they could just swoop him in. Now, it is completely unethical to try somebody when they're not there to defend themselves. Everybody agrees to this, so I'm not saying anything controversial. So that was nonsense. Now, when you actually look at the charges against this guy, he was charged with basically an order was given. Okay, so some commandos, Allied commandos, did some terrible stuff to the German civilians, right? So then Hitler gave an order that basically, if you find Allied airmen running around through the countryside who've, jettisoned the plane or whatever, then you just get a mob together and just lynch them because of the terrible things that the commandos had done to the German people. So that's not justifying it, but like, this is a war crime, ordering the lynching of Allied airmen without trials, even though it's something the Allies would do. The Allies strafed the, during the Battle of Britain, they strafed the people in their parachutes, which is a war crime. They shot at the boats that came, the airplanes that came to pick up the medical airplanes, that were supposed to be off limits. But I'm just saying, this is, and I don't know if it's true or not, but if that is true, and they say it's true, and they say Goebbels was on the radio, and they've got evidence that he was saying, hey, you guys got to lynch any Allied. So if it is, that's officially a war crime, Okay, Karl Dönitz. This is a good story. So this has got a lot of good stories involved in this. Okay, so this is the guy who, let me just read this. Commander of Germany's U-boat fleet from 1939. In 1943, Dönitz was appointed commander-in-chief of the German War Navy, succeeding Erich Raeder, who will also be at the trial as well. In May 1945, he was appointed Reich president as per Hitler's will after Hitler committed suicide. Dönitz was found guilty on counts 2 and 3 and was sentenced to 10 years of imprisonment. Okay, so he's the guy who Hitler turned it over to, and he basically did the surrender, And so this guy's just a military guy, and he has nothing to do with any of the war crime stuff. Basically, they made a claim against this guy in the actual facts of the claim, and they said that basically, in regards to submarine activity, he gave an oral order to gun down people in lifeboats, right? And they had one witness who said that that was true, that he heard the oral order. They had everybody else who was present when the oral order was gave all said that that's not true. He never or would never say anything like that, right? So basically, what is a fact is that the British had machine gunned down people in lifeboats. And so they were kind of, projecting there. And so it seemed to them reasonable that the Germans would have made such an order because the British had already committed that war crime on them. So it turns out that the Germans didn't do that particular war crime. Okay. Basically, he was convicted of not denying an order that Hitler gave to execute saboteurs and commandos after British commandos had massacred Germans in the same situation. So it's kind of similar to the previous one of Martin Bormann that we saw. And that's what he ended up getting convicted of. So when they were deliberating, and that you had the judges in the back from the different countries, right? The prosecutors have done their best, and now they're trying to figure out guilty, not guilty on counts 1, 2, 3, 4, and then what punishment for whatever they can come to an agreement on. They were deliberating on his guilt. We have the minutes of that, right? One of the judges was quoted as saying that the problem with trying to convict Admiral Karl Dönitz was that the Germans had waged a much more cleaner war than we did, so it's really hard to find a way to convict this guy. I thought that was interesting. So he ended up serving 5 years of the 10 years of imprisonment. And then he basically just went out and lived. He's a potato farmer or something. And he just went out and lived the rest of his life with his family. He wasn't involved in anything. He didn't write a book about it. Somebody towards the end came and asked him, like, but what about all that World War II stuff? And he said, Hitler was a pretty darn good commander, and the war was completely legal. That's all he said. And he didn't want to be involved in anything, and he didn't want to be got by the denazification trials or the Freudian psychologists who are coming in and doing the psychoanalyst to make sure everybody in Germany thinks the way they want them to. Anyways, so you got Hans Frank, founder of the National Socialist Attorneys Organization, Hitler's counsel in the 1930 Reichswehr trial, and after the outbreak of World War II, Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland. As Governor General, Frank was responsible for the exploitation of the population and the deportation and execution of Jews. He was found guilty on counts 3 and 4 and sentenced to death. He was executed October 16th, 1946. Okay, so this guy is the guy who handed over the 40 volumes of diaries, and then they weren't allowed to be used for his defense. And basically, one of the main things... Okay, so let's go. Here's the crimes he committed. He fought back against partisans. So you remember this is in Poland, and you've got the Einsatzgruppen, and you have all these partisans, And this is like the movie Defiance with Daniel Craig. You got all the Jews running around the woods. They're committing war crimes by terrorism, we'll just say, by literally going around and like espionage, bombing railroad tracks, trying to snipe people and this and that. And then you have the Germans who are trying to hunt down the partisans. So in the, we've talked about this before. The partisans' eyes, they're freedom fighters. In the Germans' eyes, they're literally terrorists doing war crimes. So he was responsible for ordering people to fight back against them, which any country would do. And then also executing people who helped partisans. We see that in the Defiance movie as well. And that is accurate as well and very legal. And then the forced labor. And the forced labor thing is what became illegal in Geneva in 1949, 4 years after the war ended. Okay, so now we're going to go to, the story of, we'll do Wilhelm Frick next. Okay, so he was Reich Minister of the Interior from 33 to 43 and Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia. In decisive first years of Nazi dictatorship, he directed legislation that removed Jews from public life, abolished political parties, and sent political dissidents to concentration camps. Frick was found guilty on counts 2, 3, and 4 and sentenced to death. He was executed on October 16, 1946. I don't know why they say that. They were all executed on the same night, except for the one who slipped the news. So, right before, an hour before. So, basically, this is nonsense. He directed legislation that removed Jews from public life. It's Germany. It's not Jewry. It's Germany. I just don't understand. It's your own country. You can make laws, and those laws, abolish political parties. That's not a war crime. It's not a crime against humanity. Sent political dissidents to concentration camps. Whatever. Okay. So Hans Fritzsche, this guy was a radio guy. I mean, this is just ridiculous. He had not held a policy-making decision. He talked on the radio. He was included in the absence of Joseph Goebbels and to mollify Soviet authorities who held him in their custody. He was acquitted by the IMT, was arrested again and brought before the German denazification courts. He was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment and released in September 1950. So there were a group of Germans who were at this trial and they were acquitted. We'll see who they are. And they said, man, we appeal to the court that we have safety of the Nuremberg prison cells, right? And then they needed protection to get home. And so this guy's like, I don't need protection. I'm just going. And he just walked out the door and just got arrested by the denazification squads and sentenced to 9 years imprisonment, even after he was acquitted by this court because, due process and all that. So Walther Funk, Minister of Economics and President of Reichsbank, he played an early role in driving German Jews from the economy, not a war crime, and took part in the confiscation of valuables and financial assets of Holocaust victims. So you're saying he stole stuff from dead people. Funk was found guilty on counts 2, 3, and 4 and sentenced to life in prison. He was released in 1957 due to poor health. Okay, let's do Hermann Göring. This is one of the most interesting ones because I literally never in my life have liked this dude, Hermann Göring. He was the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe. He was the dude who was, overweight and this and that. And a couple days ago, I realized that I love Hermann Göring. I mean, this guy, maybe he was terrible all of World War II and maybe he was, I don't know. But I know during the Nuremberg trials, he was a champion of men. I mean, this dude so what happened is he knew for sure that he was going to die. He is the highest level guy here, no matter how you cut it. He knew he was going to die and he was just fine with it. So he's like, I'll just defend Germany, I mean, this guy. So let's talk about him. Okay. So he was, I said commander-in-chief of their Air Force, the Luftwaffe, president of the Reichstag, director of the 4-year plan, the outbreak of war. Okay. Europe, Hitler's acknowledged successor. So when I said in a previous episode, and I'll say it again, that Rudolf Hess was the vice Führer, but he was the third most powerful person, Hermann Göring was the second most. Following Kristallnacht in November 1938, Göring was integral in Aryanization efforts, which removed Jews from the German economy, not a war crime. It was he who ordered Reinhard Heydrich to begin substantive efforts for a total solution to the Jewish question. Let's see a reference on that. Let's see a reference and a quote to your quotes, because that didn't happen at the Wannsee conference, that's for sure. And if so, the total solution, which got an episode on, was not execution. Anyways, so if you want to go to Himmler's Posen speech, and that was Himmler at Posen, and I'm still going to look into that, but that was not Göring or Adolf Hitler, obviously. He lost favor with Hitler as the war progressed, and his efforts to enter into negotiation with the Western Allies spurred Hitler to expel him from the party near the war's end, but Goering figured as chief defendant in the Nuremberg dock. Goering was found guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced to death. On the eve of his scheduled execution, he committed suicide by taking cyanide 1 hour before. Okay, let's talk about some interesting stories about this guy, okay? So this guy's political position was he was against the war with Britain. He tried to make peace, right? But they didn't let the witness come in and defend him, okay? They didn't let the witness come in and defend him. I think he was a Swiss guy, and they had him there. They just wouldn't let him come in and defend him because he was the back channel that he was back channeling with Britain for peace, and he was very against the war with the USSR, but he was convicted of crimes against peace, of course, okay? So I'm just going to go here because it's going to be a minute to get back to the other one. So first of all, this guy comes in, and when he gets up on the stand and the prosecutors are going at him, he basically destroys the prosecutors, their entire case. And he'll do this for day on end, for week on end. And he was just wrecking them because, okay, so one of the problems is that, and I discussed this in the last episode, is that the people who are doing the prosecutions know way less about what's going on in the country than the people they're prosecuting do. They have a ton of documents. They have so many documents because the Germans didn't burn any documents. They didn't feel like they did anything wrong. And so they got just millions of pages of documents. It's in a language that's foreign to them. They're getting tacky translations of them. And you're talking to people who lived through these events. And so it's a very difficult position. And they didn't have years and years to prepare. Because on a case like this, I mean, you would want to say speedy trial if you were you wouldn't have arrested him as soon as what you would have done. Anyways, so, but you would need like 10 years to build your case is what I'm saying. So basically, okay, so then they go through that, and different people in here are wavering and being weak and pathetic, and this guy's just never. He's just going at them full steam. Basically, then it gets to the end of the trial, and then basically each defendant gets to get up there and make a closing statement, right? And Goring gets up there, and I mean, I read his closing statement. It's freaking beautiful. I encourage you to do it. And he just gets up there, and he's just talking about his love for Germany. He's talking about how the German people shouldn't bear the sins of anybody who led them and the things they did. They shouldn't be put on the German people. The German people deserve to be free always, and this and that. And he's going on. And basically, it's like all around Europe, all the German POWs are just standing by these radio things, just listening in their concentration camps, in Dachau concentration camp, being, dying of starvation. They're just listening. And for a moment, they remember how beautiful Germany is. For a moment, they remember how great it is. And everybody who hates Germany at the time, they're all sitting around like, are you kidding me? It's all been propaganda. We were told this guy Hermann Goring was a complete and total dope fiend. We said we were told he was neurotic and that he was absolutely incompetent. That's what they were told. And he's literally none of those things. And they're listening to this guy talk, and they're like, is it all a lie? Like, I mean, and this is one of the beautiful things that came out of the Nuremberg trials. Instead of just executing these people, so they're still going to execute some innocent people. Like, I'm not going to argue that Hermann Goring was innocent, but they're going to let go of some innocent people. We're going to get to hear some truths from this guy. Anyways, and then basically at the end, after the sentencing, they had 15 days until they were actually going to execute them. And during that time, they did finally let them bring, like, for example, Hermann Goring's wife and daughter, who later on they had started letting them write letters. Before, they said they were writing letters, but they never sent the letters, and they never returned any letters that came back. Later on, they let them write letters, and then during the 15 days, I appreciate that, the Allies, that's respectable. You're gonna kill these guys anyways, for sure, And then, basically, so what happens is they've now sentenced everybody that they're going to sentence to hang by the neck until dead, right? And so 3 people, the 2 generals who we'll get to more details about, but I mentioned them earlier, which is General Keitel and General Jodl, and then Hermann Goring had a Luftwaffe all put in appeals saying, hey, don't kill us. Don't kill us with the noose. Give us a firing squad, a soldier's death, right? And they deny all 3 of those claims because they were just sent orders from above to deny all claims for appeals. So what happened is he talked to his priest, Hermann Goring, and then it's difficult to tell. He had befriended an American lieutenant, and he had befriended this doctor. And when the doctor came in, Hermann Goring was handcuffed to a sentinel to make sure that he didn't kill himself. But apparently he shook this guy's hand, and we know that he had cyanide in a brass casing at a different place in the building, like in storage or something. And so somehow they slipped him a cyanide pill at the last moment. And then he went and laid on his bed to contemplate. And then they had the spotlight in his eye, and he raised his hand up like he was blocking the spotlight when he looked over there, but he had dropped it in his mouth. Died about an hour before. He was going to be the first because he was the prize here, the prize person, you know? And he was going to be killed at midnight, which was going to be the first one. And then they had him timed out every so many, and they were going to take them all down and execute them. And so he escaped the news, and he even wrote a letter, and he said, "I'm sorry to my wife. I'm sorry I did this. I feel great with God that I did this, because I would have submitted to the bullet. If they had put me to the firing squad, I would have taken a soldier's death, but I'm not going to give them a coward's death of hanging, you know?" And so I thought that was interesting. Okay, let's go back to this. I feel like I have another story on him that I didn't write down, but if I think about it, I'll say it later. Okay, Rudolf Hess. So he's the one, of course, who went on the peace mission in 1941. Long-standing aide to Hitler, deputy party leader or vice Führer of the Nazi Party until 1941. 1941, Hess flew to Scotland with hopes of making peace. He was found guilty on counts 1 and 2 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was the only one of the defendants to serve the full life term. He committed suicide in prison at the age of 93. That's not true. He was assassinated in his prison cell at the age of 93. So here's an interesting story about this guy. Actually, let me do this again. Let me just flip back to here. Okay. So this guy, 41 to 45, he was in jail in England, and he basically lost his mind, you know, and he was just this crazy guy. And then they brought him for the Nuremberg trials, and he's just, they're interrogating him. He's just completely worthless. And he's like, I just only remember like maybe 2 weeks ago. Sometimes I don't even remember. I don't even know that guy's my doctor or whatever, you know? And then they're like, what do you know about Adolf Hitler? He's like, I've heard of him, you know, and this and that. And he's doing this whole thing. So then they bring Göring in to talk to him to see if he's really lost his mind. And he just doesn't even recognize Göring. And Göring's like, remember when we were doing this and that? Nope. Doesn't remember none of it. And then basically he runs this ruse that he's lost his mind. And it's pretty clever. And he gets all the way to, it's time for the trial. And they bring in the professionals, and they psychoanalyze him, and they do all their psychiatry stuff, and they say, he's gone. He's not fit for trial. And then they say, cool, okay, you don't understand this, Hess, but we're going to take all your friends to trial, and you are not going to go to trial because you're not fit. And then in that moment, he just realized, and he said, nah, everything came back to me. Take me to trial with them. And they're like, what? Yeah, no, everything came back to me. I can remember everything. Let's go. And so he volunteered to go to a trial that he had escaped through kind of a Jewish maneuvering here, and that got him life in prison, and then killed and assassinated in prison. I thought it was a very interesting story right there. So here's one of the things they wanted to convict him on. They wanted to convict him on the fact that he put his signature on the Nuremberg race laws that the Jews agreed to. So what happened in that story, and I've told in a previous episode, I'll tell real briefly, they go to Nuremberg, right, which is the party headquarters of the, you know, NSDAP, the Nazis or National Socialists. So anyways, they go there with the head Jews, the rabbis and stuff, and they say, hey, we need to get together. And we need to say, like, what is a Jew? Like, racially, what is a German? Like, if you got one grandparent that's Jewish, are you Jewish or are you German? And they agree that, okay, one grandparent Jewish, you're still German. You're 3/4 German, you know? And then, of course, down the road, your kid would be an 8th, then a 16th, then a 32nd German if they married somebody who's completely German. So anyways, they agreed to these laws. Like, what is this? So when we say Jew, we know what it is. When we say German, we know what that is, right? And so the fact that he signed that law that people didn't like, I'm sorry, it's so stupid. Okay, let's just keep going. So Alfred Jodl, he's the general, one of the generals, and this general did way less than Keitel, and he thought till the end he was going to get off. Okay, so he was the chief of the Armed Forces High Command Operational Staff. In this capacity, he directed all military campaigns except those against the Soviet Union. Jodl was found guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced to death. He was hanged the same day as everybody else, of course. So in 1953, okay, so he was killed in 46, trial in 45 and 46. So we're talking about 7 years later. At a denazification hearing in 1953, Jodl's name was completely cleared posthumously. So this guy was executed and he was innocent. Now, he thought he was going to get off or get a lesser sentence because he really didn't do anything except for just military stuff. And just as a general, you do military stuff. Now, if you slaughter POWs or something like that, I mean, that's terrible, but he wasn't charged with any of that, okay? So now we'll do Ernst Kaltenbrunner, chief of the Reich Security Main Office and chief of security police following the Reinhard Heydrich's assassination. In this position, he controlled the security police, SD, and the Gestapo. He was a prime figure in the final solution in the last years of the war. He was found guilty on counts 3 and 4 and sentenced to death. Now, this is an easy one. Ernst Kaltenbrunner. The security police, the SD, and the Gestapo did so many things that if you know, like you want to say that you want to hang this guy, hang him away, you know? So anyways, now we'll go to Wilhelm Keitel, who's the other general involved, and chief of the staff of the Armed Forces High Command. Keitel was found guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced to death. So he went second, I believe. Well, he ended up going first because Göring was going to go first. And then basically, remember he has also, him and Jodl and Göring had said, hey, we want the soldier's death for shooting. And so he was the first one to actually go through the thing. And they had constructed it so poorly that he went through the trap door, dropped down to break his neck. The trap door slapped closed, hit him in the face, broke every bone in his face. And so it was really unheroic how he ended up dying because of the disgrace of how the Allies put together the thing, the incompetence there. And then they lay him on the ground. They take pictures of him. So it's a terrible picture with, just your face smashed in. Then they strip him naked, take another picture because they're a bunch of weirdos. I have no idea, but that literally happened, you know? So he was accused of ordering the murder of a French general, okay? Even though the person that they claimed that he ordered to do it had already been interrogated by the Americans and denied that Keitel had ordered him to do it. They wouldn't let the guy beneath him testify. So the story is he ordered a guy to kill a French general. The Americans have already interrogated that guy he ordered to do. And he says, no, he didn't order me to do it. You know? So the guy didn't do nothing. Okay. So whatever. He was also accused of invading neutral Norway. We talked about this. Britain had done the same. So that's nonsense. So let's continue on. He should not have been executed. Neither should have Jodl. Erich Raeder, he's commander-in-chief of the German Navy until his resignation and retirement in May 1943. So Dönitz took over for him. We talked about him earlier. He was found guilty on counts 1, 2, and 3 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was released due to poor health in 1955 after having served 9 years of his sentence. The interesting story about this guy. So this guy should not have been convicted of anything. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. And then he made an appeal to the tribunal. And he said, please change my sentence so that I can die with my fellow Germans. You know, he said, I cannot do life in prison. Please kill me. And they declined his appeal. And then he, died 9 years later of poor health in prison. I don't know if it was caused by his incarceration. Maybe not. I'm not 100% sure. So, okay, let's do Alfred Rosenberg now. Official chief Nazi philosopher, head of the Nazi Party's Foreign Affairs Department, Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories. So we're talking about Poland, Ukraine, stuff like that, where stuff happened there. Rosenberg established an organization whose mission was to loot and confiscate European Jewish cultural treasures and bring them to Germany. As Reich Minister for the occupied East, he played a role in the extermination of Jews and the deportation of Soviet civilians for forced labor. Rosenberg was found guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced to death. He was hanged October 16th. Okay, so he played a role in the extermination of Jews. And since we're talking about the Eastern occupied territories, I'm guessing we're talking about the Einsatz group and stuff like that. So basically they mean he was fighting partisans who were committing terroristic acts out of uniform. Okay, now the deportation of Soviet civilians for forced labor is not a good thing because we're not talking about Soviet POWs here. And how many Soviets do you need? They had 11 million Soviet POWs. And that's how vast, I'll put a picture on the screen of how vast their camp network was. Wild, but I mean, the numbers are out of control. So this is also the guy who wrote the book, and the book was called The Myth of the 20th Century by Alfred Rosenberg. And it was after Mein Kampf in popularity, but it was close. So I can't remember if it was Bible, Mein Kampf, and then The Myth of the 20th Century. I think that was the order. But it was, anyways, and it's a very interesting book. The book is so heady, and it has so much cultural information in it. And you read it and you're just like, man, now, of course, people at the time knew from plays and books they've read more about their culture than I do looking from the outside. But I just look like this was a popular book because this is in the weeds. It's really going deep. And wow, who were these people that were reading this? It's pretty interesting. Worth a read if you haven't read it. Little boring, but it's just so fascinating that this could have a widespread audience. So, okay, so this is great. That he had evidence used against him that was a letter he wrote, okay? and described all the terrible, evil stuff that Alfred Rosenberg had done in the Eastern occupied territories, right? The problem is they used an excerpt of that letter. And if we had seen the whole letter, which we've seen today, he starts out the letter by saying, hey, there's some terrifying and horrible things going on in the Eastern occupied territories that Berlin needs to put a stop to. Here are the list of those things that we need to put a stop to immediately. And then he listed all the things. So they start the excerpt there. And they say, here's a list of all the things that he's guilty of. No, here's all the things that he doesn't like and he's complaining about. And those are the things he got convicted of. So that's fun. Real credible, we'll say, the trials, right? And again, some of these people did deserve it. And a ton of allies did deserve it. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, when you say, hey, here's all the evidence for the Holocaust, this is a legitimate thing that happened in the Nuremberg Trial. Okay, let's flip over here and do Fritz Sauckel, Plenipotentiary General for Deployment of Labor. In this capacity, Sauckel was responsible for providing the workforce, and in response to increased demand for workers, millions of forced laborers were taken from occupied territories. He was found guilty on counts 3 and 4 and sentenced to death. Sauckel was hanged. Okay, so, and I don't know how true these allegations are here on this particular guy, but if you talk about putting POWs into forced labor, okay, I'm okay with that. But when you talk about taking civilians from the Soviet Union, transporting them into the Eastern occupied territories, putting them into forced labor, yeah, it's a crime against humanity. If he's guilty of that, then yeah, no, I'm with it. That one I'm not going to go against. Okay, Hjalmar Schacht. This is a funny story, okay? So this guy was indicted so that they could have somebody to acquit to make the trials look fair, right? And so he was intentionally put up here, and then they're going to acquit only one person, and then it's gonna make the trials look legitimate. But then there's a prosecutor, Jackson from the United States, who decides, no, I'm going after this guy. I'm gonna get this guy convicted. But then he fails to convict him. So, but they did try to get 100% conviction. Now, I'm not gonna talk too bad about Jackson, because Jackson was a very moral person in the sense that he fought hard for these people not to be outright executed, instead to stand trial, like we talked about at the very beginning. Their only other choice was just to be shot, you know? So this guy was the Reichsbank president until 1939 and general plenipotentiary for the war economy. Superseded by Göring in economic affairs, he was removed from the Ministry of Economics in 1937 and remained as minister without portfolio until 1943. Following the assassination attempt on Hitler in 1944, Schacht was sent to a concentration camp for his loose ties with conservative resistance members. He was acquitted in Nuremberg. However, he was tried and sentenced by a denazification court to 8 years in a work camp. He was released in 1948. I'm not sure if this guy or the other guy that I told you was the one who asked for protection. One of these guys asked for protection. The other one walked out and just got the denazification thing. So the funny thing here is that he was a minister in 1937. So he was not even a minister during the war, you know? The war started in 1939, ended in 1945, of course. And following the assassination attempt on Hitler in 1944, he was sent to a concentration camp for his loose ties with conservative resistance members. Nonsense. Okay. Anyways, so now we're going to Arthur Say's Inquart, Right Governor of Austria, Deputy Governor to Hans Frank, who was up there. He was the one with the 40 diaries. In the General Government of Occupied Poland and Reichskommissar for the German-occupied Netherlands. In the latter capacity, Say's Inquart shared culpability of the deportation of Dutch Jews and the shooting of hostages. So deportation of Dutch Jews, I'm not counting that because you'd have to prove homicidal gas chambers first, which is very far from, and shooting of hostages. Now, if the shooting of hostages is a real thing, then that's a war crime, if it's a real thing. Okay, Albert Speer. This guy's very interesting. So basically, he wrote the book Inside the Third Reich. And I read it. It's a fascinating book, honestly. Now, this guy was an architect, so it's all about the architecture, and he worked closely with Hitler and the plans they had to make the, Berlin the center of the world. I can't remember what they were going to name they were going to change it to, but it had like a Latin type thing going on. And so he was Hitler's architect and Reich Minister of Armaments and Munitions from 1942. In 1937, he was, okay, this is just too much to read, okay? As Reichsminister of Armaments and Munitions, Speer used millions of forced laborers to raise production. That's true. He admits that. When they bombed the above-ground facilities, he built huge factories underground so that they could resist the bombing and they keep their war production high. During the Nuremberg Trials, Speer acknowledged the regime's guilt and his personal responsibility for using slave labor. His show of remorse helped to account for his lenient sentence. He was found guilty on counts 3 and 4 and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He was released in 1966. So this guy groveled. He had no backbone. He had no allegiance. He had no morality. And he just said whatever they wanted him to say. Like, just whatever. Any random thing that's not true. And so his testimony is kind of like the one we talked about in the last episode with Rudolf Huss, where anything they wanted him to say, he would say. And he was just absolutely despised by the others. Because some of the others had regret, guilt, this and that. But this guy had no spine. He had no backbone. He made up this whole story about how he was going to assassinate Hitler in No, there's no evidence of it. 1945, yeah, there's no evidence of it. But I knew there was a duct in this building, and if I did this and I pumped gas in the room, I could get him and all of his. But then I decided not to do that because I saw that the people still adored him, so I hesitated on that. And, and he's just making up, and everybody is just like, gotta be kidding me, old Speer, So his book was very good, and I wouldn't not read his book if you're interested, because there's all types of pictures and diagrams in there. It's a really interesting book. But anyways, so that's that guy. Okay, now this guy's interesting, Julius Streicher. Okay, so he was propagandist and editor of Der Stürmer, a virulently anti-Semitic newspaper. A leading organizer of Nazi Germany's first official Reich-wide boycott of Jewish businesses in April 1933, Streicher had lost credibility in party circles by 1940. Streicher was found guilty on count 4 of the indictment and sentenced to death. Yeah, okay, so this guy, he didn't do nothing wrong. He didn't do anything wrong. He's propagandist and editor of Der Stürmer, right? And he had anti-Semitic thoughts that he voiced, He was a real racist, this guy. That's his war crime. That's what he did. He didn't incite people to do something. Like, don't get me wrong. If you had Joseph Goebbels here, right? And you said, Jack, should they have hung Joseph Goebbels? If you've seen my episode, the answer is yes, they should have hung him. Because he was not just a propagandist. He literally told people on Kristallnacht to go against Hitler's orders and go out there and murder Jews and burn down synagogues. And just commit crimes. Like, he did things that were intensely criminal. Nobody has any claim that Julius Streicher has anything criminal he did. And funny story, they were going into the trial and he was walking next to Donitz, who the admiral, who also didn't do nothing wrong, like literally didn't. He just did his. And Donitz turns to him and says, hey, at least one of us has nothing to worry about, because Streicher obviously has the least to worry about of anybody here. And you can see him, if you see, what people don't take into account is that of people in the entire world, there's one people who are more petty and vindictive than any other people on the planet. And if you are one of those people, you probably hate Julius Streicher more than you hate Göring, because Göring did things to your people, but this guy said things about your people. And so you can even see him during the trial, and he's like peering around, and then he writes in his diary, and he's like, they're all Jews here. They're a bunch of Jews. Look at all these prosecutors. And of course, every single American prosecutor was Jewish. And most of the British prosecutors were Jewish. Only one of the Soviet prosecutors were Jewish, which I find interesting. And so they just killed this dude. This is not legit at all. They just killed this dude. He didn't do anything. I mean, he didn't even do anything warlike, whatever. Okay, so let's continue on. Konstantin von Neurath, foreign minister of Germany, Reich protector for Bohemia and Moravia from 39 to 41. He was found guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was released in 54 due to ill health after serving 8 years of his sentence. So this is a guy, and one of his lawyers who was defending him here, he got put in prison while he was defending Neurath for 6 weeks without a charge or a claim that there was going to be a charge, just to try to make sure this guy doesn't get acquitted, because he should have been acquitted, So Franz von Papen, let's do this. We're getting close to the end of the list here. Okay, so he's the former Chancellor of Germany, ambassador to Austria, 34 to 38, ambassador to Turkey, 39 to 44. As ambassador to Austria, he paved the way for the Anschluss, which was the legal rejoining of Germany and Austria. He failed in his attempts to persuade Turkey to join Germany in World War II. Papen was acquitted of all charges in Nuremberg. In 1949, a denazification court sentenced him to time in labor camp. However, he was released immediately following appeals. Okay, so basically, what history says, if you looking back with 2020 hindsight, and I'm not saying that I can't prove that they maliciously prosecuted this guy, because they did acquit him, but history looks back and says that Franz von Papen did not, there's no evidence that he tried to bring Turkey into the war, you know? And even the idea that you would give somebody a war crime for trying to get somebody into a war, you know? Like, imagine if we're invading Iraq and Iraq's like, hey, neighbor, please help us. You know what I mean? We need help. We're getting invaded. And then, or something like that, you know? And then they're like, hey, get that guy who asked the neighbor to help him. Get him. That's a war crime. Doesn't make sense. Anyways, so he got acquitted. So to the credit of the court. And then, okay, Joachim von Ribbentrop. So he was the foreign minister of Germany. He played a role in the annexation of Bohemia and Moravia and in the attack on Poland in September 1939. He also persuaded leaders of other countries to deport Jews to concentration camps. He was found guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced to death. Okay, so this was the foreign minister, right? Okay, so this was the Ribbentrop who was obviously involved in the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was the pact that if Germany invaded Poland, that Russia would indeed invade Poland too. And it was kept in secret. The pact was, right? So basically, for his defense, an unnamed American officer who had some morality, right, gave the defense of Ribbentrop, his lawyers, the text of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? And remember, the Soviets are the ones prosecuting, and they're saying, Ribbentrop, you did a war crime. You were in on the attack on Poland. No, actually, he was the one trying to get peace. He was the one trying to stop the invasion by contacting them and trying to get them to wake up. But they were so secure in their Polish defensive pact. So whatever. Anyways, so the defense now has the Molotov-Ribbentrop text, which of course Ribbentrop knows about it and was trying to get. And it had been kept secret until this time. So they tried to introduce it as evidence, but all the prosecutors fought to block it, and they ended up making it inadmissible. The judges ruled as inadmissible as a forgery, and it wasn't. And it was published immediately in a St. Louis newspaper and then became public knowledge. And it really makes the Nuremberg trials look farcical because at the time there wasn't a lot of knowledge of that. And if it hadn't been released to the press, we might not even know about it today. We might have been like, yeah, the Soviets probably, they weren't trying to violate neutral Poland. They were just being opportunistic. And they thought in a long game strategy, the less land Hitler had taken from Poland, the better. Therefore, they jumped on it, you know, and really kind of helped the Western Allies. You could say that if you didn't know about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Okay, and then he persuaded leaders of other countries to deport Jews to concentration camps. And that, again, goes back to the same argument, is if they had homicidal gas chambers in them and they were gassing them, then he's a part and party to that, and he should be hanged. Okay, so one last one. Baldur von Schirach, leader of the Hitler Youth and Gauleiter in Austria. In this position, his responsibilities included deporting Jews from Vienna to Poland. Schirach was found guilty on count 4 and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. He was released in 1966, so same year as Albert Speer. Okay, so this guy, this is the guy I was telling you about. He was going to denounce Hitler in order to try, and he's half American. He's half American, half German. And then when he literally got the news that they had stole his kids and imprisoned his wife, he decided, nah, it's cool. Just take it, you know. Anyways, so basically, in this whole scenario, let me flip off of here. In this whole scenario, everybody felt the exact same way, right? All the Germans did. They feared the Soviets, they respected the British, and they absolutely detested the Americans because the Americans were just the worst, worse than the Soviets. Like, you know what you're going to get from the Soviets. You know it. And I'll tell you what they got. They got 22 people, 22 defendants. They got, Soviets said, guilty, all 4 counts, all 22 defendants, death penalty for everybody. That was their vote. You know what you're going to get. And so they're feared. Yeah, they're the Soviets. But, like, if you think that the Soviet prosecutor has a choice in, like, what he's going to recommend, or the Soviet judge and what he's going to decide, you know what I'm saying? And then the Americans, they were just despised because they were just doing underhanded things and well, every single one of the prosecutors was Jewish. So there we go. Anyways, so, okay. So here's a good story involved in a poor credibility of the Nuremberg trials, okay? So there was this guy, and his name was Hans Bernd Gisevius. I'm going to write it on the screen in case you want to look up this guy and see this whole story, because it's a story in and of itself. He was a witness against Göring who had an OSS handler because he was working for the United States as an agent, So he was basically a complete plant, and his handler was Alan Dulles, station chief for the American OSS, who will later become head of the CIA and then will lose the head of the CIA position after the Bay of Pigs. This guy, and then if we get into JFK and the assassination and stuff like that, this guy plays a role, right? So anyways, so this guy Hans Bernd Gisevius was an agent working for, was a resource of Alan Dulles's, who was just putting American propaganda as if he was an independent witness on the stand against Goering. So that was interesting. Oh, let me tell you the story about the guy I told you about on Tuesday's episode. So there was a doctor, his name was Dr. Franz Blaha. I'll put the name up on the screen in case you want to look this one up too. He was a Czech doctor, and he was a Dachau survivor of the Dachau concentration camp, right? And he was called as a prosecution witness. The prosecution called him to testify about the morality of the German doctors' experimentation on the prisoners. He ended up getting up there and saying, "Nah, I mean, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't immoral, this and that." They pull him off the stand, deport him back to Dachau, and imprison him in Dachau. A civilian doctor. And this is not the Soviets. This is the Western Allies. Civilian doctor imprisoned in Dachau in order to punish. Man, it sounds like Nazis or something, Anyways, it's a wildly long episode. I'm going to have to cut it in 2 parts for a bit or something. I don't know what I'll do. I'll figure that out later. But I want to bring in a couple factors. If you look at references 6 and 7 below, they're both about the Katyn Massacre and the Nuremberg Trials. I'm not going to pull them up and go into detail too much, but we already did that in a previous episode. I'll put a link in the description below to it. And basically, they said that at the Nuremberg Trials, that the Soviets were allowed to prosecute the Germans for the Katyn Massacre, which everybody knew the Soviets had done. And they were allowed to do that because it happened in the East, so it happened in their zone of influence. So then they get to, so it's kind of like saying, whatever happened in Gaza with the last couple of years, it happened in Israel's sphere of influence. So Israel needs to prosecute anybody who did it. And Israel's like, there were no war crimes at all. There was absolutely nothing. And that's kind of the same thing that happened. That also goes against the credibility and validity of the Nuremberg trials. We talked in Tuesday's episode about the confession of Rudolf Höss, and that was when they're saying all these people are working to deport Jews, that they mean that they're going to deport them to do the things that Hess claimed in his phony confession. In my opinion, you can see that episode if you want. And then I want to do real quick, I want to do the Dachau trials because I want to compare them. And I had talked about them in this entire thing leading up to this. So let me go full screen and go to here. So this is the 8th reference below at his Jewish virtual library, so a Jewish source, Dachau Trials. I'm just going to read the first part, okay? 1945, 1947. In a series of a few dozen cases before a U.S. military tribunal, so this is the U.S., but the U.S. are the ones who liberated Dachau, so I'll give them that. Lasting from 45 to 47, more than 100 members of the staff at Dachau concentration camp faced charges of war crimes related to atrocities committed at and around the camp. A total of 465 trials were conducted involving 1,676 accused war criminals. In the major case, United States of America versus Martin Gottfried Weiss et al., 42 officials at Dachau were tried from November to December 45. All were found guilty. 36 of the defendants were sentenced to death on December 13th, 45, of whom 23 were hanged on May 28, 29, 46, including the commandant, Martin Weiss, the camp doctor, Karl Schilling, the rest of various terms of imprisonment. So you can go down here. It's got literally everybody and every case if you want to check this out. So I want to point out here that Martin Weiss was also previously the camp commandant at Majdanek, and he was also in trouble for the gassings that happened there, because you remember at this point 2 million people had died. I'll put the graph up on screen. 2 million people had died in 1945 at Majdanek, Jews, and then now it's at 76,000, 78,000 or something. So he obviously, that's not a real thing. And then Dr. Karl Schilling was executed, and then just remember the story that we just told about the Czech doctor Blaha, who testified at the Nuremberg trials that they weren't committing crimes with the experiments, but the Americans killed them. So this is also this place where the people were having their testicles kicked in, and so I mean, honestly, if you go back to the episode 9 days ago, so that would be the one on Dachau, episode 20 in the series, I was more willing to say that this was legitimate. Now, I just look at it and I think, man, I don't know if that's legitimate either, because it's the same people doing these terrible things. Anyways, this is a long episode. That's what I got for you guys. If you want to look at any more episodes in the Holocaust series, there's a link to the website below, and that'll take you straight to the Holocaust series page. You could look at any episodes you want. That's all I got for you kids out there yelling for me to come out. Anyways, hope you guys have a great weekend. See you next week.